would like to welcome Kamon Reynolds. He is an internet personality on YouTube. He's got a YouTube channel, and he's going to be talking with us tonight on sustainability and growing your bee yard. He's a Central Tennessee beekeeper. He keeps 300 hives, more or less, with his wife, Laurel, and has been very good about acknowledging her contributions to him. So he's a good guy. He has an educational YouTube channel for beekeepers. He sells nukes, queens, and honey. And two of his goals are to help beekeepers to have success keeping their honeybees alive and thriving, and to continue establishing an experimental yard to gather more information on honeybee genetics and varroa mite control. Kamon's been keeping bees for 17 years, and it looks like he started when he was 1 year old, but he's actually slightly older than 17 or 18. So we'd like to welcome him and turn it over to him to speak to us. Thank you, Kamon.
Thanks everybody for coming on, and thank you for having me. It's always a lot of fun to meet new beekeepers, especially right now where we've all been deprived in a lot of ways of being able to see each other more often and those kind of things. And this definitely is something that I've had to become accustomed to, because until this year, I'd never done a Zoom meeting. I didn't even know they existed. It's just amazing the technology that's out there. I think this is my 6th one. So hopefully by now I won't mess it up too bad. But yes, Laurel is a big part of our business, and just, she just doesn't want to talk, but I more than make up for that, and then some, I guess. So basically, what we do around here, like she said, is we produce nucleus colonies, queens, and we also sell honey. The last couple of years, Laurel strong-armed me into doing a YouTube channel. I had no desire to do anything on the internet. I've never been into new things. I've always liked older things. But it seems like whenever I've discovered a recipe, a formula for high levels of success for me, and that is I've got to say it won't work. My wife has to say it will, and then I have to cave and go with whatever she says. And then it seems to work out always well in the end. So I'm thinking about going to Las Vegas with that philosophy and telling her that we shouldn't bet on something. She needs to say that it will work, and then we do it, and I just be a millionaire overnight. Anyways, it seems to be working pretty well. But yeah, the whole it's weird. I've had several 10 and 12-year-olds talk about me being a tuber or a YouTuber, and that's just really weird because I never thought in my wildest dreams I would be doing stuff online or anything like that, which is interesting because my dad and my two brothers are all computer programmers of some sort, and I can't hardly turn one on. So let's get to what I do know a little bit about, and that's bees. So I want to run through just a couple things about what we're doing through winter before I get into my main topic, because that was one thing that was kind of asked of me originally is what are we doing right now? And honestly, we're not doing a lot. We're building some boxes like I was today. We're getting prepped to do some wax dipping and some painting to preserve the equipment, cleaning a few things up, basically getting around to doing things we couldn't during the summer, maybe move a hive or two around to new bee yards. But honestly, we really don't do a lot in the winter months. We don't feed our bees this time of the year. Once we get to about when the maple pollens start blooming, then we'll start throwing some pollen patties on to even out any nutritional deficiencies. Let's say the bees don't have any bee bread in the hive, or maybe the maple bloomed, it got them going, but then there's been some rough weather for 2 or 3 weeks. So we throw those pollen patties on to smooth things out. But primarily in winter, we don't do a lot. We spend a lot of late September and October prepping our bees for winter, making sure they had plenty of food. And now they're all tucked away. So basically just odds and ends winter work prepping for next season is pretty much all the winter work that we'll do. Besides oxalic acid vapor treatment. And we will do 2 treatments a week apart later this month, probably starting next week, and then we'll do it the following week after. I really don't like waiting into January just because the day length starts getting longer and the bees are naturally wanting to start brooding in January just a little bit. It depends on how mild the year is, but we want to get hopefully the mites when there's no brood in the colony. So that's pretty much what our winter is summed up. We don't have a whole lot of fun stuff going on. Tedious work. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of this talk, though. So, sustainability. Obviously, a lot of people throw that word around. It's really important to be sustainable because beekeeping can be very expensive if you're having to buy bees a lot. And I've been there. I've probably lost and purchased more bees than anybody that unless you know a commercial beekeeper who's had poor success. But even though I started at the latter part of 14 years old, there's a lot of things that I just didn't know. I read a lot of books, which can be very helpful, but there wasn't a whole lot of mentors in my area. And the ones that I had weren't very successful. And so it was like a little bit of the blind leading the blind. And sometimes that's all you can get. And I was struggling for years. And then, of course, you get online a lot of times because maybe you can find some information on there after a few years of poor success locally. Maybe you can find somebody online to help you with your bees. And I found the wrong type of people. And they were really into just let the bees be bees and, don't do anything. Um, I don't agree with that philosophy for multiple reasons anymore. At the time I did, and it just was a constant struggle. And I purchased bees from treatment-free beekeepers. I was able to raise my own queens. I was catching swarms. I was trying to do everything that I could to get those resistance and local genetics and everything that they say that you want to do. I mean, I could talk for an hour just on the attempts that I had at treatment-free beekeeping that all ended up in pretty much failure. So over time, I've come to where I am now, which is a business, but I lost a lot of bees along the way due to lack of experience and education on my part. So let's back up into the 60s and 70s when things in beekeeping were very different. But even back then, the USDA released a report in the 70s that 70% of first year swarms perished. That's not good. But nature is very rough on just about anything: bees, horses, cows, buffalo, just anything you can think of. Rabbits have they don't last very long. Everything's trying to get a rabbit. So with honeybees, it's no different. And with proper care, honeybees can do really well. With no care and left to nature's whims, they can die very quickly. They're a very dynamic insect, and when everything is going for them, they grow at a rapid rate and they can do some amazing things. But they also are very dynamic when they're going downhill. They can perish very quickly because of their short lifespan. So back before we had varroa mites, tracheomites, both strains of nosema, some of these new viruses that we have, before we had small hive beetle, a lot of these pressures that our bees are dealing with, and more hornets that are probably going to be coming. We have red tanagers and all these things that are trying to eat our bees and get something from them, because healthy bees are very good food for things out in nature. So there's a lot of things that are putting pressure on our bees. Hang on one second. Anyways, so everything's trying to get something from our bees, and it's a big problem. But even back in these days, prior to all these pests, you were losing that many bees. So I think what that should tell us is even in conditions prior to varroa and all these stressors, bees still have a high chance of dying without the ideal conditions. And the ideal conditions are a good cavity size, which nature does not always provide, especially these days where folks log trees at a pretty small size compared to what they used to. Also, there's just loss of habitat. Maybe the forage isn't as good, and obviously there's all these pressures. So there's all these things chipping away at these percentages. And as beekeepers, if we can understand what's causing the issues, then we can really help our bees not have those high 70% yearly losses. Now, granted, the study concluded that second year bees had a much higher chance of survivability than first year. I think it dropped down to 50%. That's still, I don't want to lose 50% of my bees every year. Honestly, I'd like to lose zero, but somewhere around 10, 15%, even 20 or 30%, you can survive with that. Don't really want to lose any bees, but we're constantly splitting, and that's something that you also can learn from the bees. That's what bees do. They split all the time, constantly swarming, and that's very healthy for them in a lot of ways. Keeping young queens, it helps slow down the mites, and just there's more numbers out there. So as I got more along into my beekeeping career, I guess if you could call it that, I realized just all these negative effects that are going on with our bees. And also realized that our bees have some shortcomings. They're not a perfect creature, nothing is. And sometimes they'll swarm at times that it's a really poor idea. But bees can't really just sit down and have really a whole lot of abstract thought or anything like that. They're really a slave to their tendencies, their genetics. And so if they feel the stimuli to swarm at a terrible time of the year, sometimes they'll do it. What I like to do is always make sure that I stay ahead of the bees and realize kind of what's going on in my hives. And in the springtime, if I feel like they're going to really want to swarm, I'll make a split. I'm not one of those guys that tries to produce, monstrous honey crops. I do like to see 100-pound yields. And some years I get that off of several hives. 2019 was a fantastic year for us. We had bee yards that averaged over 100 pounds a hive. That was a really nice year. This year, that same yard did about 70-something pounds. And we had better looking hives, I thought, going into this spring. But the spring yield wasn't there. It was too cool, too much rain, all that kind of stuff. So we're kind of also at the whim of nature. Some years it's easier on our bees than others. And as beekeepers, I think what we are is basically, we're kind of like a bee guardian. I know it sounds a little maybe cheesy, but our job is to identify the bee's strengths, the bee's weaknesses, the pests, and learn and understand them in order to be sustainable. And as good of a beekeeper as you can be, you're still going to lose some hives. It happens. Gotta get that off of there. So I talk to Michael Palmer occasionally, not like on the phone or anything like that. Randy Oliver, Ian Stepler. I don't know if you all know of these guys, but every one of these beekeepers has well over 1,000, 2,000 colonies. I talked to Bob Benny down in Georgia more and more, and he's got about 2,000 hives. But one of the things that you learn from these fellas, and it's really nice to just listen to them because it makes you feel a little better. You feel better about yourself because you realize that even though these guys have been beekeeping longer than I've been alive, many of them, that they still, some of the things they're dealing with is what I'm dealing with too. They're just, how they handle things is on a different level. And a lot of that has to do with losses. And you can look at it as kind of losses, but I'd say besides varroa mites, my number one issue is queen issues. And I can't tell you how many times a year I get questions, whether it was people sending it to me on my email or a YouTube channel about queen issues and how to get a colony straightened out. And the answer is sometimes, even if you're a professional, you can't get it fixed. Sometimes bees are just, they have no desire to accept that new queen that you put in there. They get too far along and they just won't, the ship cannot be righted. And I don't know how many times over the years that I've tried to fix those colonies and tried different methods. And what I've always found is that typically, if the colony's really far queenless, let's say that they have no brood in there, they swarmed out, you were hoping they'd come back with that virgin would come back. Maybe she didn't. Red tanager got a hold of her, hornet, something. Your colony is now in dire straits. It's got no young brood. Pheromones are all out of whack. You don't have a queen. You order one. By the time it gets there, the 11th hour is typically already gone at that point. And a lot of times you end up wasting a $35, $40 queen. It's very frustrating. And, why am I saying all this? Because this is an important part of sustainability. You've got to sometimes learn to let go on those colonies. Now, we don't want to lose our combs. Combs are extremely valuable, and that doesn't mean that we're going to kill the bees. You can combine them back with a paper combine. That's typically what I do. Instead of trying to fix that colony, I'll just combine it to another colony that's in good shape. And then if I want to recover that colony that was lost, per se, I'm going to make a split. And that is as natural as anything to make splits. And beekeeping is really, you're constantly changing your numbers. In spring, it's really easy to grow your colonies. In summer, especially in my area where we have dearths of nectar and pollen in late June, July, and August, and sometimes September if there's no rains, then it can be a really challenging to make successful splits and keep our bees healthy, especially if they don't have a lot of resources in summer. And if the mites get up, well, you can lose your shirt. You can lose 80-90%, in my experience. Let's say we've taken care of the mites, though. The queen issues are still there. And I know that usually in a bee yard of about 40 colonies over the course of the year, I'll probably have somewhere between 4, 5 colonies that go through some queen issues. And a lot of times I'm able to fix them if I get to them early, but there's some that I just cannot. And you can waste a queen, and I have got extra queens typically, but I have been able to see it so many times and repeat after itself time and time again that typically I waste a wonderful queen on a colony like that. Because even if they accept her initially, they'll let her lay just long enough to where they can raise their own brood off of her. And then they'll kill her and raise a queen, or attempt to raise a queen. But the problem is it usually just repeats itself in a cycle because that colony is so weak, has no brood but what little she provided, that by the time, let's say that queen does actually go out and get mated and come back, a lot of times they're so weak that it's too far gone. And you spend so much time, of your time on these wimpy colonies that are high maintenance and very, very low percentage of success. Again, paper combine those is the way we deal with them. We focus on our champs, and I want to say eliminate the wimps, but we combine them back and we weed them out. And I think that's part of our breeding program. But how does this apply to somebody who's got 3 hives or 5 hives? Because I've got hundreds, so it's a little bit easier for me because I have a lot of resources to deal with. Well, first of all, for someone who's wanting to achieve sustainability, I would say 3 hives is probably as small as you would want to go. And I know that seems like a lot for someone who's brand new. But 3 to 5 hives is definitely, in my opinion, the best combination, smallest number for having a sustainable apiary. You've got to have brood to give. You've got to be able to expect losses. That doesn't mean you have 5 big hives per se, but what I would love to see more of, in my opinion, is to have 3 nice production colonies, however you like to run them, all mediums, all deeps, however, a combination of both. Have your 3 main colonies, and then during a period where they're all looking good, make 2 nucleus colonies. Purchase queens if you can't raise your own, and make those splits, because I promise you at some point you're going to have one that the queen, maybe they swarmed, maybe they superseded and the new queen didn't come back. There's a lot of things that can happen, but you have those insurance colonies, and that is as natural and as smart as anything as you can do. Everyone I talk to who is successful, that's what they do. That's sustainability in a nutshell right there. So queen issues, they happen to everybody. I just wanted to kind of say that because I get that question a lot. And no matter how good you are, sometimes it's almost impossible to fix them. And usually by the time if you let's say you take a bunch of brood from this really good colony and this colony, and you combine them and then put a queen in there, you're like, well, I can fix the colony that way. The way I look at it, though, is yeah, you may have fixed it that way, but you still have all those old bees. It's still a higher percentage of them eliminating that queen that you purchased. And then also, you could have just taken that brood from these multiple hives of yours and made a split with just nothing but young nurse bees. And that's how we make almost all of our splits here, is with young bees. Young nurse bees, they're easy to make splits with. They're easy to combine. They're like gullible little children that'll believe anything an adult says. And I don't mean that in a negative way towards children, but that is the way nurse bees are. They're very docile towards queens. They're awesome. Those old bees don't like queen changes, and they're usually the ones causing all the issues. Let me get into some of my pictures right here, and then we'll talk more about sustainability. Okay, so desktop, there. All right, and present. Now, like they mentioned, I have a YouTube channel. It's kind of weird because I think of myself as a beekeeper, and I don't even hardly think about the YouTube a whole lot. But Tennessee's Bees is the name. LLC is the name of our beekeeping company. That hive tool in the far right over here, that's something I gave Laurel before we were married. She was into beekeeping before we got married. So that was obviously extremely wise decision for me. I got her that hive tool and an American Bee Journal subscription. And then I got them both back when we got married a few years later. And she had a lot of decent bit of beekeeping experience to start with, which was really awesome. Got very fortunate. I want to show my kids really quick. Now, this is an old photo because they're 8 and 5 now. But I love this one. We've changed our system so much over the years. But here I am. It looks like March, sometime in March. And Jimmy's right here. There's always somebody in the bee yard that's just not ready for this. And he's got that little bid that says, I'm breaking the budget, which is more true today than it was back then. This is Laurel right here. This is about as good of a picture she'll let me show anybody. We set up this yard several years ago, and we just got finished. And she was working with Jimmy as a 1-year-old, tucked underneath the bee suit. So she's very tough, very tough. This little picture of Jimmy over here, I like to present this one right here. This is when somebody asks me why anybody would want to keep bees. And that's the face that I get every time that somebody says, why would you want to keep bees for? And I just get that little face right there. I love it. All right. So this is me working with the kids on the next generation on grafting queens. Kathleen's actually started grafting queens last year. Well, I guess earlier this year. It's her first time to graft queens. And I think out of a bar of 30, she ended up with 8 that actually took. So, but you start them young. She's only 8 years old. By the time she's my age, goodness, I'll just probably be doing paperwork. All right. This is a clip of one of our bee yards real quick. Just going through some bees. All right. So here is one of my favorite photos. It's just a gorgeous photo. And you can just see all those diverse colors of bee bread down in there. And this is, I'd say, early April, sometime around then. I know North Carolina's like this in a lot of ways, but there's those times of the year, in April especially, where there's just so much pollen in the air. Excuse me, the bees they can bring in everything. And there's so much of it, half of it seems to go up our noses and allergies and stuff. This is so crucial to a healthy colony. Whenever we make our splits, we make sure that we give them a frame of bee bread. It makes all the difference in the world. Pollen subs can be helpful, but they're nothing close to the real thing. They can just kind of help a little bit, but they're nothing close to the real thing at all. This right here, you can see over on the left-hand side maybe of this photo, all that jelly down in here. And can you all see my little pointer right here? Anybody let me know?
Yeah, we can see it.
Excellent. All right. So When I'm grafting for our queens and the genetics, I don't want anything that's really big like this over here. I want something that's more this range right here. You can totally go for these right here. Those, and you can just see any of these would be good. Some people get a little issue when they start getting a little bit on the big side right here. I'm not one of those people. I've never had any issues with the queens raised from that. Some people get really particular. I find that the best queens are always locally made. And I think I noticed that the next speaker you have coming on is going to be talking about sperm viability of queens. And that's a really interesting topic. And I think it's a huge possibly a very huge issue that we're dealing with. I know when I ship queens in, I have a lot more issues than when I raise them myself. And I just wonder if a lot of times it's not from the bees getting in like a UPS truck or a USPS or FedEx or whatever. And I've worked in those kind of vehicles before. And in summer, they can get blistering hot back in there. And it just makes you wonder if those queens are getting, if they're getting up to 106, 110 degrees, and that sperm viability there is no viability after that. Pretty much, you lose so much, and then your queen's no good. She looks great, but she just can't perform. But this is what I want to see when I'm grafting those queens. So I get a lot of questions on that. This is what happens when you've got the combination of what we preach: great queens, dead mites, and good nutrition. This queen obviously has no sperm viability problems. There's no inbred characteristics about this colony. It seems like every one of her eggs is being accepted because it's good. Those of you who don't know that if the queen mates with a drone that's too similar to her genetically speaking, that they'll actually cannibalize that brood because they don't want inbred bees in the hive. So it makes it really interesting whenever you try to artificially inseminate queens or anything like that, which we don't do. But it's an interesting topic. Bees love genetic diversity. But this right here is in August. Not the best time of the year for us, but we really preach hammering those mites. This is us right here setting up a colony for raising queens. And it is as packed or more packed inside the colony as it is outside. We take raising queens here very seriously. It's very important to us. We use our own queens, so obviously we need to raise the best because I want the best. And it takes a ridiculous amount of nurse bees to make a ridiculous amount of queens. Like that math, huh? That's beekeeping math right there. But yeah, it takes a lot of nurse bees, a lot of nutrition. I'm not spending a lot of time on this because not everybody here is going to be into raising their own queens. You can totally purchase them, but this is just part of what we do for sustainability. Now, these are the queen cells. This is day 7, I believe. They cap them on the end of day 6, and this is exactly what we want to see. This white creamy stuff is the royal jelly up top. Nice developed cells. They don't have to be quite that big when you're raising queens, but obviously I like the bigger the better. It shows me that our queens have been spared no expense, and that's exactly what we want with our queens and genetics. There's one that was just caged. This is an Italian bee that we raised, and that one's fixing to go into a hive. So she went from laying to in a hive within an hour. I think that's a big deal as well. And whoops, I had that one on twice. That must have been so good I needed to show it to you twice. A nectar shake right there. That's awesome when they're bringing in so much. This was during the blackberry flow and clover as well, and just so much nectar in those frames. So I show you all this because, one, I wanted you to see a little bit of our operation and what we do. But also, it's all about great queens, dead mites, and good nutrition. And some people disagree with the dead mites, but it is true. Even if you're a treatment-free beekeeper, something, whether it's UFOs getting in your beehives, eliminating the mites, whether you have some special super bee that I've never been able to find, or whether you're doing it for them, something's got to get rid of those mites. And great queens are very important. I think many beekeepers don't understand when they're having queen issues. And basically how I address colony problems is, okay, first thing, we assume that it's mites or viruses because they are the world's biggest problem without question. And so alcohol washes are typically how I determine that if I sus- suspect that there's a problem with mites. And if I've confirmed that that's not an issue, and I'm not seeing any visible signs of viruses, deformed wing virus or sac-brid virus, then and I'm seeing plenty of nutrition. That's why it's nice. That's why everyone recommends, the bee clubs recommend you have more than one hive, because when you have other hives in the yard, you can see how they're taking the feed that you're feeding, or how they're responding to the nectar flows, or how they're brooding up. You're able to gauge what this colony should be looking like by comparing it to your champs. And if it's not a mite problem and it's not a nutrition problem, then it is a queen problem, in my opinion, and we requeen that colony. And, sometimes if it's February, we're throwing pollen patties on like this. And these are some Ultra Bee patties that we make here at the house. And a very simple recipe. This is a big recipe, but it's just 15 pounds of Ultra Bee, the dry stuff, and then 32 pounds of either Pro Sweet syrup or sucrose syrup, something really thick. It's like a honey thickness, and it's pretty easy to mix. So this is everyone's concerned with the pollen patties, right? Small hive beetle larvae. And we feed a lot of patties, but over time you kind of learn not to feed too much, and you kind of get a gauge for what the colony can handle. But typically when I have issues like this, it's because I threw it on right at the start of like a pollen flow, and then the bees won't eat it very quickly because they're more concerned with the real stuff. And then it's just sitting in there ripe for the picking for the beetles. But, a big, strong colony will be able to fend that off no problem and chuck them out. Strong bees are able to withstand a lot. Here's the alcohol wash I mentioned up earlier. A lot of people don't like doing these, and I understand why they don't. However, they're an extremely valuable tool. And I'm hoping there's a man that I know that's developing a wash for mites that does not kill the bees, and it's not CO2. And I can't say anything more than that, but I'm very optimistic that he will get that developed, and I'm really hoping that it is, because I would love to be able to get an accurate count of the mites without having to sacrifice bees in the process. But this is a valuable tool. In the experimental yard that we're putting in starting in 2021, we'll be using this tool a lot so we can get accurate data on what is working with our mite treatments and all that kind of stuff. All right, let me get out of here real quick. Stop that share. All right, so one other area of sustainability that I'd like to talk about, because splitting is by far my favorite way to do it, but there's another way that can be utilized, especially by beekeepers that have a little bit more time. For me, I really don't like doing cutouts. I don't like catching swarms a lot anymore because it's just hardly worth the time, and it's hard to come by the time. But it's a lot of, it's fun when it works out for you. It's not too hard. But also there's swarm traps, and these are a fun way of kind of being sustainable. It's not perfect, and a lot depends on your area and the habitat of the bees. But back a few years ago, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I was doing a lot more swarm trapping. I was putting about 15 or 16 up. And between me and my friend and I, who's in Carthage, Tennessee, we had about 45 swarm traps put up, and we usually averaged 40 to 60% a year, depending on the year. We never had a year below 40% catch rate. So that's pretty good. That's several bees. The problem is you get some that are kind of wimpy and need a lot of baby, and you get some champs, and it varies quite a bit. But you can put your swarm traps up and get yourself some extra bees, and I think it's a great way to do it. All we do, we use 10 frame deep boxes, old ones, because we had them lying around, but you can make them pretty easily. You don't even have to get fancy. You don't have to do all the hand holds and all the fancy corner joints. And just throw you in some old beeswax in there that combs would be even better. Some propolis,
Grace?
lemongrass oil is what we always
Yes.
use, but Swarm Commander is a
Oh,
product out there that's supposed to work a
how
little
are you?
better. I don't know if it does or not, but we caught a lot of swarms that way, and
Oh,
I think North Carolina has a pretty good habitat for bees. It's very similar to Tennessee, a lot of trees and stuff like that. I know there's places in Tennessee that don't have a lot of trees, but it's something to look into. Those swarm traps can be very, very useful, especially when you have, two or three hives. You can catch one or two swarms that can really boost your percentages of your bee yard up. And I think it's a fun thing to do for sure. I've got a couple of videos on all of these topics, from splitting to the swarm traps. If you go to my playlist on YouTube, I have several videos on how I go about it. I don't have all the answers for sure. But the swarm trapping has worked very good for me. And over the course of years, you find areas that are hot spots. And maybe it's just because there's a beekeeper a mile down the road that can't keep swarming. I don't know. Um, but I think swarm trapping, I know several beekeepers, and that's basically all they do. That they don't really manage their bees a whole lot. And so they expect their losses, and they catch swarms and do cutouts and swarm traps. And that's really not my way of beekeeping. It seems like a lot more work to me. Um, but it totally is a way to do it. And one of the cons with swarm trapping is you may not catch a thing. There's some people that'll catch 20 or 30 in a year, though, with swarm traps. So definitely keep that option available to yourself if you're trying to increase your bee yard. But I really feel, especially in spring, if you've got those healthy, strong hives, split them a little bit. It doesn't have to be much, especially if you do it like, say, April, mid-April. And this all comes down to what you want with your bees. Personally, I hate swarms. I hate sending a swarm off almost as much as I hate anything besides mites. There's nothing even close to that. But instead of getting running a risk of a colony swarming, I would much prefer make that split, get another beehive. Maybe instead of getting a potential 100 pounds of honey off of that colony, I only get 70 pounds or 65, whatever. That's okay, because those bees that I've split off, it is much better that I keep them. It's better for them too, because they're going to have a much higher chance of success with me than they are going onto the wild blue yonder. Because, like I said, the USDA, back before all of these passed, 70% die in their first year. It means only 3 out of 10 survive. I can promise you those bees stay here in my boxes at my place, and I'm going to get at least 8 out of 10 to survive. So that's a much different percentage, and I would bet that typically I can get 9 out of 10. But that comes to management, and I would encourage you all, if you're wanting to be successful on a high level, that I'm not saying we all are going to be professional beekeepers, because some people don't have that desire. And some days I wonder, especially when you're growing your business, and we're starting to plateau a little bit, thankfully, where we're not growing constantly, where it's more stressful. But I mean, when you make it a business, it takes some of the joy and the fun out of beekeeping, because there's so much that depends upon it, and you've invested so much time and energy and money into it. So I don't readily encourage people to get into the beekeeping business, because whenever you take something that you really enjoy and you turn it into that, it becomes a frustration. But it's also a frustration when you're blowing money all the time, even with your hobby, because your bees are dying. And trust me, I've been there. You've got to focus on the three keys. I mean, honestly, great queens, dead mites, and good nutrition. And if you're not sure if your queen's any good, then I recommend, if possible, buying a new one, making a split with that old queen, put the new queen in the hive that was, maybe you're like, I don't know if she needs requeened or not. Make that split. I think a lot of people would be surprised how often a new young queen makes a big difference. They really do, especially in the South. We get a lot of different information, but bees that are in North Carolina and Tennessee, and especially even further south, they lay all the time. They lay just so many eggs throughout the season. It wears them out. They don't last as long as queens that are in northern areas that experience shorter seasons. They just physically wear out. That's my opinion. I've had queens go into 4 seasons, but they definitely don't look in their fourth season like they did in their second season or their first season. And typically, I find that queens that are past their second season usually are just they're hardly they're not very good for production. They're really, they can kind of sustain a colony, but that's about it. And some bees, it's just really an interesting topic to talk about superseding colonies because some bees are really good about it. It's a great genetic, and that's one thing we look for in breeding for queens is does this colony have the ability to requeen itself when the queen needs to be requeened? And some colonies aren't like that. They just kind of let themselves go down with the queen. And it's really interesting why some do that and some don't. Those would be ones, I guess, that would be weeded out of the genetic gene pool. Maybe we've brought this on ourselves by maybe domesticating the bees a little bit more, but we do everything we can to combat that around here. But getting back to hobby level beekeeping and sustainability, swarm trapping is a great way to do it. Maybe you can do some other stuff. I really hate cutouts myself. There's several guys on YouTube that specialize in that, and I'm terrible. And I never want to be good at it, in my opinion. I just don't enjoy it at all. But making those splits, going to those strong colonies, and making those bees in the prime part of your season in April, May, and June. And I make splits later than that. If I've got some great colonies like those pictures that I had up of those 2 great frames of brood in August, and those are just 2 frames. If I have colonies like that, they get split in August. Now we have to really baby those young splits. We got to feed them sugar syrup because they're small. We got to give them some pollen patties. We give them a new queen, but they do very well for us. I think I split about 50 colonies in August this year, and not all of them worked out. I think I had about a 93% success rate with them, somewhere in that area, which is, I can live with that. That's just part of the sustainability game. Realize there will be losses. In agriculture, there's no such thing as 100% all the time. It's very seldom ever 100%. Raising queens, I usually count on between 60 and 70% success. Sometimes of the year when things align, I'll get 90% or so to come back. And there's times where I'll get 50%. So that's just part of not just professional beekeeping, but just beekeeping. It's nature. And so expecting that is really important. But definitely, in order to maintain 3 hives, I highly recommend that you plan on having around 5 at some point in the year. The same goes with 10, or always have those insurance colonies. I always have extra colonies. If I need 300 colonies to survive, run my business and support my family, then you can bet your boots I'm going to have more than that going into winter. Things happen, and that's just part of it. Eliminate those mites. If you're wanting to have high levels of success, you've got to control them. I don't know any other way of being highly successful with bees other than that. There's other people out there that talk differently, but we take our mites extremely seriously around here. We make sure they stay low in population. And because of that, our bees are experiencing high levels of thriving and success because they don't have high levels of viruses and mites chipping away at their percentages, and especially going into winter. A lot of people ask me, winter stuff, but pretty much 90% of winter is what you do in August and September here. And I think you all would be very similar to that. August and September are very important months. By the time, October is important too. You can feed up your bees if they're light. But typically, if you're trying to get a lot of extra brood in October, it's difficult. Bees don't want to raise brood very much in October. They're wanting to decline with the sunlight. What is your treatment for mites, somebody asks? Well, I use a lot of different things. Apivar, oxalic acid vapor, thymol. And that's the primary reason we're putting in this experimental yard in 2021 is 50 colonies, actually 52 colonies devoted towards testing out these natural treatments and using them according to recommendations and going into brood breaks, which is something I'm really excited about, using oxalic acid vapor with brood breaks. Basically, you make a time split. So you get your split, you get your new queen. You also get a short period without any mites being underneath the brood. And for those of you who don't know, about 80% of your mites are going to be underneath the capped brood in the frame. So oxalic acid vapor only lasts in the colony. Some people, and I'm one of those people, believe only kill the mites that are exposed during that period of oxalic acid vapor. So if 80% of them are in the capped brood, you're looking at a 20% kill, best case scenario. And if you can create a split, which is important for sustainability, and killing the mites at the same time, you're creating a perfect situation for resetting that clock with the mites, getting that young queen in there, getting that insurance colony or replacement colony. That it's just good business. It's good on the hobby level too. And I would urge anyone on here who's thinking about going from like 5 hives to 50 or 10 to 100 or something like that. Be very careful. I've done that so many times over the years. It never worked out for me. You grow with your bees. And honestly, if you can't manage 10 in a successful, profitable manner, then you cannot do it with 20 or 100. You just cannot. I can speak from a lot of experience in that regard. And once you get to the point where you are having consistent success, and I'm not talking with big levels of colonies, because some of my favorite beekeepers in the state of Tennessee run 10, 20 colonies, but they're ultra successful with their bees because they understand sustainability. They understand that there's going to be losses and issues with queens, that mites are a big issue, and they manage them. And because of that, these people are selling honey all the time. They constantly have it in stock because their bees are healthy at the right times of the year when honey's being produced. They sell nukes, and they make a few thousand, $4,000 on the side every year. And that's cool. I would love to see so many more beekeepers doing that. It's not all about money, but bees are very much programmed about, it's not about the money to them, but it's about the honey. And if your bees are able to produce money for you, obviously they're healthy. Only healthy bees do that. The healthiest honeybees make the biggest crops. They make the most bees. So I really think there's nothing. People sometimes like, oh, you're taking advantage of the bees, Kamon. You're doing all these evil things. You need to be more natural and get that hippie powder out and start sprinkling it around. If there's any hippies on here, I apologize. But seriously, it is a joint coexistence between humans and the bees. And I truly believe this, that when we as humans understand our bees, not only their strengths, but also their weaknesses, and we understand their pests, that working together, it is a wonderful thing for the bees, and it's a wonderful thing for the beekeeper as well. It's a great coexistence between both parties, and the bees experience much higher levels of survivability. And obviously, we as beekeepers get to enjoy the fruits of their and our labor and safeguard our bees at the same time. I look at wild horses, Mustangs and stuff like that. And because nature's so rough on them, foraging conditions, and even other horses competing with each other, which is kind of like bees robbing one another. Wild horses typically have like half the lifespan of a horse that is well taken care of by a person, because we give them protection, we give them ideal conditions. And that's what my goal is with our bees. So that's my philosophy with beekeeping. That's kind of what I look for. When I'm trying to learn more about my bees, is what can I do? What do my bees need? What is it that I don't understand about the pest that I could understand better and address? So Chuck Hampton asked, what's your treatment for mites? I already answered that. So oxalic acid vapor. Yeah, the oxalic acid vapor, I pretty much only use in a couple situations. I'm going to use in December twice, a week apart, because usually you miss some mites. It's not 100% kill. It's cheap, and it's the best time of the year oxalic acid vapor works. The only other time of the year I'll use oxalic acid vapor is if I'm making splits that create brood breaks, where there's full mite exposure, and then that oxalic acid vapor is worth my time. But you talk about oxalic acid vapor on 300 hives with brood in there. 5 rounds in the 21-day period does not give me 90% kill. Some people believe that. I've never had that kind of success with it on a consistent basis over a whole bee yard of testing. Usually I end up in the 70 to 80% range, which isn't that bad, but that means I'm going to have to treat again in a couple months. And you talk about 5 treatments times 300 hives, that's 1,500 treatments. And, Laurel doesn't enjoy that. And what she doesn't enjoy, I don't enjoy. So neither one of us like that very much. Is there any questions or anything in regards to what I've talked about, sustainability or swarm traps or anything kind of like that? Or even something that's not related? I'm kind of opening up the floor here.
Kamon, we have a question about what is the best place to put a swarm trap?
Good question.
Or what goes into choosing a place?
Well, Dr. Thomas Seeley has a really nice book on swarm traps. And I'm sure his information is really, really good stuff. But I typically find that I don't have to do everything that he does to have success. I don't do all of the ideals because I think there has to be a kind of a happy marriage between what's not going to risk breaking my neck and what is also going to work for the bees. And bees typically like them higher. I think he recommends typically something that's more like, I can't remember, 15, 18, 20 feet, something like that. 16, I can't remember. I typically put mine about shoulder height. And that's the height. Now, as far as where I'm looking for a location when I'm looking out, first off, I want to make sure that nobody can see it if that's possible. So I don't like other beekeepers swiping my swarm traps. Never had that happen, but I've always been very careful. And, 99% of beekeepers won't do that. But just like a rotten apple in the bushel basket, it just kind of messes it up for everybody. I want to find a little clearing. I don't like having bees in thick woods where they're just tree all over the place and it's hard for them to get access to it. That's not a really good spot. I want it right at the edge of a clearing. It's nice if it's easy access for me. So shoulder height. That way I don't have to get a ladder out to take it off the stand. If you watch my videos, you can kind of see how I have my little stands that I put them on. I do 10 frame deep, so they can get really heavy. If you get a good swarm go in there and you don't get to it for 7 to 10 days, that sucker could weigh 60 pounds. So that's something to watch out for. Now, I have caught so many swarms over the years from dead out equipment where I've left them in my bee yard or I've stuck them in my shed. So bees are really attracted to drawn comb. If I had the option of going between swarm commander or lemongrass, a lure like that, or having old brood comb and propolis in the swarm trap, I'm totally going with the brood comb and the propolis. It makes a big difference if you have a little bit of that. Some people like Dr. Seeley and a lot of these guys will just put up a box with the bait in there at the edge of that clearing. And, then you come back a week later and you have to cut all that out. I absolutely hate that. It's a bigger investment to put frames in there and starter strips and level the hive out. But if you do that, you can actually, they'll build it out and you can just pull them on out and it's really nice. You can obviously use foundations too, but it's a little bit more expensive. But I like it easy. That's just what it comes down to. But yeah, just a clearing like that. Maybe you can find a spot that's close to a river, if possible, not to where it's going to flood. But I typically find around here that bees do, swarms seem to be a lot more common around riverways in my area. But then again, we have basically really big hills, creeks and rivers, and very small fields here. Anything else? But yeah, so just interrupt me if you get a question or something. But as far as the swarm traps go, again, I keep it real simple. I usually do 1 or 2 sprits. You can overdo it with those lures if you choose to use one. If you get it too powerful in there, they won't go into the swarm trap. And you can use smaller stuff like 5-frame nukes. The only issue I have with that is if you get that big cluster of bees that needs that 10-frame box, they're going to fill that up and they'll be ready to swarm out of that in a very short order. So you have to be really on top of these things. I usually, well, when I had time, I would come back about every 2 weeks. But typically these days, I'm lucky to get back to them within the month. I still have one swarm trap with bees in it from this spring that I haven't gotten off of the swarm trap. So Brian says that he caught 13 on a power line last year, and that sounds like a really good spot. And one, because you probably don't have a lot of people traveling those power lines. And again, you got the woods, but then you got that little clearing space right there. That could be a really good spot. And I just think North Carolina and Tennessee are really good areas for swarm trapping. Now, what about wild bees a little bit? Just real quick, there are some more wild bees out there, but most bees, I would argue, that we catch in our swarm traps are from a beekeeper, whether it was from 3 years ago, whether it was from 1 year ago. They're not extremely wild. Occasionally you get some bees that are more like that. Typically, I don't find that they're that much different from our bees as far as extremely aggressive. Now, I have gotten some that were really wild, and let me tell you, you pop the lid on those things, and they come after you in squadron formation, and you find a new queen quick, and you change those genetics because nobody likes their socks stapled to their ankles. And I've got kids, and my kids don't like getting stung. We really try to breed a gentle bee, but swarm trapping can be a lot of fun. And I think, out west where it's really dry and there's not as much habitat, the bees, there's not as many of them in certain parts of the west, some places more, but I think North Carolina is a great state, just in my opinion, for swarm trapping.
Mm-hmm. If anybody's not talking, could you please mute yourself right now? Get a little feedback going on. Thank you.
Oh, I think that was Jimmy that ran into the door. He's I tell you, he gets in his bee suit. I have a picture of him. He fell asleep on my couch just 2 days ago, and he put on his bee suit. He's at that age. He likes to dress up as Superman, or every now and then he's a beekeeper. He fell asleep on the couch as a beekeeper, and he woke up in the middle of the night trying to scratch his face, and he had those bee gloves on, and that veil still over his face, and the poor kid couldn't figure out what was going on. But it's one of the struggles of being a beekeeper's son, I guess. But now he gets out there, and I've got a YouTube video I haven't uploaded where he's telling everybody that he's letting me help him today with the bees, which I thought was hilarious. And he's something else. But going along with, I didn't touch much on mites. I'm going to touch on them just real quick on a different section. So, like I mentioned before about the brood breaks and how valuable that is, many people ask, well, how do the bees in the wild deal with that? And my biggest argument to the whole, treatment free versus non-treatment free is the reason the bees are able to get away with it is because they're doing something that we are totally not. They are swarming and they're swarming and they're swarming. And again, they die at a much higher rate than my bees do. So it's not all of them are surviving. It's a percentage of them. How many of these bees we catch in our swarm traps or we catch in swarms are actually from beekeepers or less than 2 years? We don't know. But my argument for those bees that could be wild bees that make it is that they're just swarming like crazy, and that really sets the mites back. However, that can be a really big pain for beekeepers to, you don't want to just let your bees go 40 feet up in a tree and have to get them out. I've climbed those trees before, and I'm 32 now. I don't do crazy stuff like that anymore. I'm also married, and my wife won't let me do things like that anymore. But I've got some interesting stories of climbing trees, but I don't like letting my bees swarm out like that and getting those brood breaks in that way. But I do feel like that is one of nature's tools. And there's more and more research coming out all the time on how those brood breaks are really rough on the mites. And obviously it doesn't kill them because we have a brood break in winter. And so it's not enough by itself, but it does set them back. and especially with a really nice, gentle treatment with like oxalic acid vapor, something that I feel like is a very natural treatment because it's present in honey naturally, which I obviously don't use it during when your honey supers are on. But I eat algae and a few other things for health. And I know it sounds really weird, but I'm a weird guy. So I do a lot of stuff like that. And there's a lot of oxalic acid in kale and spinach and Swiss chard and spirulina. And it's normal to have a certain degree of that around. So I don't have a problem with using that treatment. I really feel, though, as a beekeeping community across this country, we have done overall a poor job of dealing with mites and understanding. And that's not anybody's individual fault, but it was just a few years ago we understood that the mites were feeding on the fat bodies and not the blood, which totally makes sense now that we know that. But that gives us information that we can utilize to form better strategies. And some of them are trying to be developed right now. But also, when oxalic acid vapor came over, everyone touted it as this is the silver bullet, and it's not. Unfortunately, nothing's that easy in life. And that's, if there's one thing I've learned in 32 years of being alive, is that there is no easy button. If there is, somebody needs to share it with me right now. But there is no easy button, and so you have to put in that brain power and that time. And I really feel like, though, I'm hoping with this experimental yard that we're going to be doing 4 groups of 13 colonies. And one group is going to be oxalic acid vapor only with brood breaks. And I'm hoping we get some really good results, because I think what we can do is teach a split that is timed. So you get 13 more colonies potentially. And both the parent and the new colony, the daughter colony, are going to have a brief 5 to 7 day period of brood exposure, mite exposure. There's no capped brood, and you can hit them with that oxalic acid vapor, and we can get the reduction for the year. And then you just use oxalic acid vapor in the winter. And I'm not one of those people that recommends that you use the same treatment every time, because that's poor strategy, but still something that is going to give us consistency, because I know too many beekeepers that are, whether they realize it or not, that are suffering from weak colonies coming out of winter or losses because they're not treating enough or not treating at all. That's just my opinion. Should we be concerned that the bees have used more of their stores this year because of the mild temperatures than in years past? We've had a lot of really mild years over the last decade or so. The last few years have been colder, in my opinion. I don't know what it's like in North Carolina, but we've had some really cool years the last couple of years here in Tennessee, which I've kind of appreciated from a standpoint of how much I'm sweating through my bee suit. But the bees do prefer it warm. Whether it's warm or cold, they've got to have those stores. It is always a cause for concern. And before I understood kind of what my bees needed, you're always kind of sweating those bullets, so to speak, during winter because you're concerned. Thankfully, that we have other options that you can use in emergency situations, obviously sugar bricks and stuff. But me personally, at the end of our fall flow, which really starts to taper off towards the end of September, yes, there's pollens come in and there's a few odds and ends coming in. But for the most part, there's not a whole lot of nectar at that point. Nectar does not typically come in when you're getting a lot of those cool days. And this year it got cooler a lot earlier, I thought. At least it did here. And so that cut off the flow of nectar pretty quickly. So usually by late September, I'm going in there and I'm feeding any colonies that need it. And usually out of 300 colonies, I'll end up with about my big ones that don't need hardly a thing. And then I'll end up with my August splits that need probably 3 or 4 gallons. And then I'll have several that are in between. And we focus really hard in late September and October here on getting those colonies up and feed. I like being able to do liquid feeding. One, because it's faster and quicker. That's the same thing, isn't it? It's faster and cheaper. That makes more sense. And also, I like the fact that the bees are able to put it in the combs, which is very natural. And also, when the bees are bringing in that sugar syrup in thinner forms, like 2-to-1, as opposed to like a really heavy pro sweet that's already like honey thickness, they're able to impart enzymes and other things to that and make it more like honey. It's definitely not honey, but at least it's more like it, which is healthier on the bees during the winter. It discourages it crystallizing in the combs when it's thinner. So that's really nice. But if you have any concerns with food, I don't care if it's 20 degrees outside. Personally, if I know that they're light and they need it now, I'll get my sugar brick or mountain camp sugar, whatever. I'll get an extra box or some spacer above, and I'll feed them. That 20 degrees, yeah, they don't need to be exposed to a lot, but bees can withstand it for a couple minutes, and that sugar brick is going to keep them alive if they have no food. I'm actually fixing to do a video on some sugar bricks and stuff. And actually my video for tomorrow, if I can get it edited by in the morning, which I say Laurel will be the one doing the editing, hopefully for all of us. It's going to be on a very inexpensive and cheap method of degranulating buckets of honey. That was an issue I faced for years back. And the crazy thing is I finally figured out a cheap method to do it. And it's after I don't need buckets anymore. I'm using barrels now. Isn't that how life goes? But it costs about, if you have none of the parts, it'll cost you about $30, but you can degranulate 3 buckets at a time. And that can be really helpful. And it keeps it in a safe temperature range, so you're not, exposing your honey to 120 degrees or 110 or anything like that. So hopefully that video will be up in the morning. But we're always trying to figure out new things around here for our bees. Any more questions? Wow, that tea is so sweet. I've never had that much tea in my life. I must have needed it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kamon. I really appreciate you coming and talking with us. We will go ahead and move along and get some door prizes given out.